All right, so welcome everyone to the first day of class. Again, I'm your professor and my name is Dr. Espino Perez. And today we will be learning about psychology as a science. All right, so first I wanted to start a little bit about sharing a little bit about who I am. You've already watched the video, hopefully, on the class policies, and then we'll discuss what science is and why we should study psychology. And this is just an old-timey illustration of what people used to think of the brain as being like, so you could see all the different scenarios that are happening in this brain. So when we were thinking about the brain and memory, this is sort of what we considered happening inside of the brain. All right, so who am I? I have shared already that my name is Dr. Kathy Espino Perez. I'm actually not from Oregon. I'm from North Hollywood, California. I went to a school similar to Western Oregon for my undergraduate degree, Cal State Northridge. I also went there for my master's degree. Then I got my PhD at UC Santa Barbara. That's the University of California at Santa Barbara. And then I did my postdoc, which is additional training at Wake Forest. And since then, I have been at Western Oregon University. All right, so what kind of work do I do? So I'm a professor here in the psychology department, and part of my role, apart from teaching, is to conduct academic research. My area of specialty is doing research on prejudice, discrimination, and stigma. So my current work explores people's multiple social identities and how that might influence belonging and compatibility in college. But some more interesting, more recent work is focusing on the changing nature of prejudice or negative attitudes that people have towards different racial and ethnic groups. Historically, what we find is that white people in general tend to have higher prejudice against racial and ethnic minority groups than racial and ethnic minority groups do. But in some of my recent surveys, I've found that actually white people are reporting less levels of prejudice against racial and ethnic minorities relative to racial and ethnic minorities. So we're exploring causes and consequences of this shift in prejudice, whether it reveals a true shift in attitudes or whether it's just some bias in self-report. All right, what else is important about me? So this is my son. His name is Diego. He is a little bit older now than he has appeared in these videos. He's about 2 years old and 3 months. But he is a reason that all of you are being provided flex due dates so that you can complete assignments later than usual. He's often sick, and I often have to record lectures for my in-person classes. But you won't be disrupted with that because all of you are taking this online class. He is sick today, in fact, but we must keep going and we'll continue on with today's lecture. All right, so on our course Canvas, I do want to get to know a little bit about you. So I want you to share your name. Obviously, it'll be associated with your course Canvas account, your year in school, something personal, but not too personal, something professional, like what you want to do after you graduate, what your career ambitions are, maybe even why you are taking this class, what you're interested in learning in this class, and then also something that you think might be peculiar or interesting about yourself. Personal about me, I have a 2-year-old. I just recently started going to the gym again. I'm weight training and I'm trying to get into cardio. I used to be a really big runner when I was in grad school. But the obligations of being a professor sort of put that in the back burner. To be a professor was my ultimate goal. So I've achieved that goal and now I'm looking for more professional goals. Something interesting about me, I guess that my research is really focused on diversity and inclusion. I have not published that much in that area, but I think what I am working on more than anything is including or creating greater levels of inclusion and diversity in higher education. So I'm working on the committee for becoming a Hispanic serving institution at Western Oregon. I have a few National Science Foundation grants with colleagues here at Western, along with colleagues at OSU. I'm trying to build a pipeline of scholars from underrepresented groups to get into grad school. And I have another NSF application grant that is currently under review that will create a support network for Latina scholars in social psychology. So yeah, that's sort of my life's purpose at this point. All right, so what about this class? After you finish this class, or during the course of this class, you're going to cultivate a general knowledge of the theories and current findings of psychological science. You're going to demonstrate an understanding of the methods underlying psychological research, and you're going to understand how basic theory and experimental findings are informed by and or applied to everyday situations. So we talked about this class with regards to the syllabus in the other video that I've already uploaded. So we've already taken this. What's the policy for missing class? It's an online class, so there really isn't a policy. The only policy I have, I guess, is that you must watch the lecture videos in order. And you should watch the lecture videos on a Tuesday, Thursday schedule, as I noted in the other video that I recorded. Your exams will be online. If you miss a lecture, you should look at your syllabus, your online slides, your book, and 2 other people before contacting me. We are not meeting in person, so you do not have to share your information with anyone else. But I may randomly assign you to 2 people, and I'll introduce all of you as being the core group that you should reach out to in case you have any questions about this class. All right, so often I get questions about how to do well in class. So what are some research-backed tips for doing well in class? So this not only applies to this class, but any class you take during your college career or in life. 1, read the assigned readings. Don't just rely on the lecture. I only have so much time to lecture and to include information, so I try to hit the major points. But if you want to learn more about the nitty-gritty and do well and get an A on exams, for instance, you need to read the assigned readings. Practice the material and practice it frequently outside of class. You're lucky that this is a psychology class because many of the theories that we will learn about are directly applicable to your daily lives. Take good notes by hand. This is one of the most important predictors of success. Taking notes or using a laptop usually isn't very good. What people tend to do when they take notes with a computer or a laptop is they tend to have a lot of verbatim overlap, which means that you just tend to write every single word that the professor says instead of trying to capture the main ideas and writing those things down, which is something that people who write their notes by hand do. Review your notes before each class, and also let me know if you have any questions. And I think this is one of the most important points. Keep track of how you're doing. If you are not doing very well, if you don't do very well in the first exam, don't wait until the end of the term to let me know that you are failing the class and you want to know what you can do to pass. Because at that point, my hands are tied. But if you're not doing very well in the class to begin with, you should schedule an appointment with me so that we can talk about some strategies to help you improve your performance in this class. All right, so let's look and move forward onto some lecture material. All right, so what is psychology? So psychology is the study or knowledge of the soul. At least that's how people who speak Latin would define it. But more contemporarily, we define psychology as the scientific study of the mind and behavior. So when we talk about the mind, what we're talking about is anything involving mental processes and events, so anything happening within your brain, and behavior, so things that we can observe or things that we can measure. And this is often referred to as psychological science. And I know that when people tend to think about science or scientific fields, psychology is not one of the first fields that they think of. Often we think of more STEMmy fields like biology and chemistry, but psychology is a science. And why is it a science? Because we employ the scientific method, which we'll talk about next lecture. All right, so some topics that we study in psychology include: do racial and ethnic minorities distrust white people? If they do, why would they? And what are the consequences of this distrust? Another research question we might explore are certain areas of the brain responsible for experiencing physical pain. Do those areas overlap with the experience of emotional pain? Why do we forget some things? And why are some people smarter than others? So you can see just by these 4 research questions, the types of research that is explored within psychology varies greatly. And this doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of all of the different topics we're interested as psychologists. So science. Is psychology a science? Yes, it is a science, because science describes a method of conducting research. So as mentioned earlier, we will discuss this in our second lecture. So psychology is usually distinguished, or the way that people study the field of psychology is distinguished in 3 ways. The first way is the employment setting, so where you work. The second is the field of study, or what you study. And the third is the perspective. So what kind of frameworks do you use to guide your work? For employment setting, we usually have 2 broad categories. The first is academic psychologists, and that's someone like me. I do some basic research for teaching and advancing knowledge. And applied psychologists tend to use psychological principles or methods to address problems of the individual, society, or industry. And this would be more along the lines of someone who is a clinical psychologist or a therapist. So for people that are academic psychologists, this is usually seen as someone who is a professor, someone who might be a graduate student or a postdoctoral scholar. For applied psychologists, you could consider someone who's working as a consultant or someone who's being a counselor or therapist as an example of an applied psychologist. Right. What about fields of study? So there are all kinds of different branches of psychology. So the first is developmental psychology. So this explores the ways that people change psychologically across the lifespan. And they can examine questions from different perspectives. So often when we think of developmental psychology, if you've heard of developmental psychology, people tend to think about just childhood, maybe adolescence, but developmental psychologists actually study from the womb to the tomb, or from the beginning of life until death. So developmental psychologists can track any changes across the entire lifespan. So let's say you are a developmental psychologist. Your approach or your perspective can be different. So someone who has a biobehavioral approach or perspective might focus on more biological explanations for how people develop. So for instance, they might ask questions like, does the stress hormone cortisol influence children's friendship development? Another field of study is social psychology, and that is my area. So this is exploring how the real, implied, or imagined presence of others influences an individual's behavior. So for instance, when do people develop a racial or ethnic identity? And this social psychology can be a perspective that's applied to developmental psychology as well. All right, so let's talk more about the perspectives that we'll be discussing in today's class. So we're going to go through each of these 6 perspectives. So the first is biobehavioral, the second is cognitive, the third is evolutionary, fourth is positive, fifth is psychodynamic, and your 6th is social cultural. So what is the biobehavioral perspective? Just by looking at the title, you can probably tell that it has something to do with the body. So with a biobehavioral perspective, our goal is to understand human behavior through understanding the interactions between the human brain and the body. So sometimes this can include things like understanding people's genes or genetic makeup. So one example of the biobehavioral perspective is this challenge and threat model that uses the heart to measure the mind. So let me explain this in a different way. So in stressful situations, your heart beats faster and harder, and this occurs in every stressful situations. But some stressful situations you may perceive as having enough resources to deal with. So for instance, my son being sick and me not being able to head into work today in person is a stressful situation. However, I have the resources needed to deal with it. I have a computer. I can email my boss and tell them that I'll be working from home. I can record my lectures. So because I have the resources available to deal with this stressor, I'm experiencing challenge. So what you would see if you were to connect me to a machine that is measuring my arteries, the dilation of my arteries, and how much blood I'm pumping or blood pressure, you would see a dilation in my arteries and an increase in the blood that is pumped through my body. But if I was in a stressful situation that I did not have the resources or didn't perceive myself to have the resources to deal with, so as an example, I was in a car accident with my son. It wasn't a big deal, but I got rear-ended. I didn't know what to do. I'd been in a car accident before, and usually I know what to do with myself, but I was scared that my son was hurt. So I experienced threat. And because I didn't perceive myself to have the resources or the wherewithal to know what to do, if you could hook me up to a machine, you would see constriction of my arteries and you would see less blood pumped through my body. So what they're trying to do with this kind of research is they're trying to see what people's responses to threat and psychological evaluations of threat by looking at the body's responses. All right, so let's move on to cognitive psychology. Ooh, this is really cool. All right, so with cognitive psychology, this is one of my favorite perspectives. We tend to focus on thinking, learning, memory, intelligence, and language. So we tend to focus on people's, let's see. So we tend to see the human mind as extraordinarily complex, and we think of the mind as a computer. Often we don't know or can't communicate information that we are perceiving. And some factors like prejudice, if I were to ask you if you're prejudiced against any groups, or if I were to ask anyone really if they're prejudiced against any groups, most people would respond with no, even though they might harbor some prejudice. All right, so for researchers like me who study prejudice and discrimination, we need to find new or novel ways to assess levels of prejudice that can get beyond people's own controlled responses in trying to look non-prejudiced by saying that they don't have prejudice against different groups. All right, so what we do is one way that we look at people's levels of prejudice is by having them look at pictures. So we create probably thousands of computer-generated images of faces. So these are faces that have been computer-generated from images of real people, but they've been combined so that the person that is generated isn't someone that we can readily identify, but it looks real enough that we're able to say, like, this person is human. So what we have usually is a base image. So this is the base image that we're using. And through a set of trials, we have sets of random noise. So for instance, for this base image, we have this set of random noise. So think about it as static. The pattern of the static changes And this is also base image, and this is inverted random noise. So it's the inverse of this set of random noise. And this is what stimulus 1 looks like versus stimulus 2 looks like based on the snow or the noise that's added to the picture. So what we have you do across many trials is, okay, I want you to select the photo that looks more like a student at Western Oregon. And we have you select either stimulus 1 or stimulus 2. And most people are like, well, they look pretty similar, but across many, many trials, maybe hundreds of trials, you might think, well, I'm just choosing a face randomly. But what ends up happening is that after we have all of those faces selected, we morph them together. What we find is a significant difference in how people perceive their in-group or students at Western Oregon University versus an out-group, students at Oregon State, for instance. So the in-group you'll see looks a little bit happier, maybe more human-like. Their eyes look more alive. Whereas the out-group it looks a little bit more blurry, maybe a little bit more upset. So by using this technique, which is called a reverse correlation, we're able to detect people's own biases that occur below conscious awareness. Oof, that was a long explanation. Okay, evolutionary perspective. Great. So the evolutionary perspective talks about the human brain and mind and how that evolved in very specific ways to help our ancestors solve the sorts of problems that they might have experienced over evolutionary time. One researcher that actually works at Western Oregon University, she is the department chair of our psychology department, has investigated whether engagement ring purchases can be related to mate value or how much your partner values you. So let's see what the study investigated. So in this study, they manipulated a discrepancy in the physical attractiveness of romantic partners to determine its effects on hypothetical engagement ring purchases. So they predicted that men would purchase larger and more expensive rings when imagining themselves mated to more attractive rather than a less attractive woman. So in other words, if men perceive their partner to be more attractive than them, they will purchase a larger ring than if they perceive their partner to be equally attractive or less attractive than them, in which case they will buy a smaller engagement ring. And along those same lines, they expected that women would desire larger, more expensive engagement rings when they imagine themselves mated to a less attractive rather than a more attractive man. So if a woman perceives themselves to be more attractive in the relationship to their male partner, they would expect a bigger ring than if they perceive their partner to be more attractive than them. And they found their hypotheses to be true. So how does this relate to evolutionary psychology? Well, throughout evolutionary history, the person or the mate who had the most amount of resources, historically, that was the ability to hunt, the ability to provide shelter, and so on and so forth, was the mate who was able to procreate. That has changed now so that we use engagement rings as a symbolic measure of a person's worth and or ability to provide with resources. All right, what about positive psychology? Positive psychology uses psychological science to study human strength and positive attitudes. So it just focuses on all the positive aspects of psychology. So for instance, you might focus on resilience or the ability to cope with adverse experiences. So everyone experiences stress, but some people are able to weather that stress more than others. So positive psychologists might investigate what are the factors that make some individuals more resilient to stress versus others, with the hopes that we can teach other people to be resilient in the face of stress. Other people study happiness, what it means, where people derive happiness from, how people can maintain happiness, so on and so forth. Then we have the psychodynamic perspective, which has to do with Freud. So you all have heard of Freud, I'm sure you have. And in this perspective, human beings are strongly affected by unconscious conflicts and motivations that may be expressed in their behavior and personality. However, this perspective has been debunked. We don't really use Freud in our psychological research anymore. And finally, we have the social cultural perspective. This one's really fun. So with this perspective, we're interested in learning whether culture and our society shapes human psychology. So some of you might be bicultural. I myself am bicultural. I'm Mexican American. So I have both a collectivistic culture, which is my Mexican side. We love being with family. We love sharing our resources. We think of ourselves as belonging to a group instead of being an individual. Whereas I'm also American, and as an American, we're more of an individualistic society. We're motivated by success, individual success, and so on and so forth. So how does being bicultural affect people's perspective? So one of my favorite hypotheses within the social cultural perspective is the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. So in this hypothesis, researchers argue that the structure of language, so the way that we use language, the words that we use in our language, or even, I'm not sure if ASL has been investigated, but I'm sure that ASL would have an influence in shaping people's perceptions and categorization of things. So what they did in this study is they recruited both native Spanish speakers and native German speakers. And they had them look at a picture of a key, the same key, and had them describe the key. So for those of you who speak Spanish, you know, key is feminine. We say la llave. And as a result, people that speak Spanish or are native Spanish speakers describe the key as more golden, intricate, little, lovely, and tiny, things that are, or traits that are consistent with the feminine perception of the key in Spanish, whereas the key in German, I do not want to butcher the way that we say key in German, but it is perceived as masculine. German speakers describe the key as hard, heavy, jagged, metal, and useful. Again, the construction of language, how you perceive things as feminine or masculine, influences how people describe everyday objects like keys. Okay, great. So let's talk about schools of early psychological science. So we'll go through these different schools of early psychological science just so that you can understand where science or where psychology was born. So when we think of psychology, psychology was really born as a union between philosophy and biology. So philosophers argued that the brain functioned in this way and the body functioned in this way, but they really were just discussing theories, whereas biology was really exploring the functions of the body. So when we're combining theoretical perspectives on how the brain and body work versus actual information about how the body works, it allowed us to design different experiments and employ the scientific method to test philosophers' ideas about the mind and body. So structuralists were one of the earliest schools of psychological science, and they studied the content of the mind. So for instance, this includes Edward Titchener, who introduced something called introspection. So looking within to study the mind in a scientific manner. So this would be something like you sitting down and thinking about what you're thinking about and thinking about why you're thinking about those things, and so on and so forth. So not studying the portions of your mind, but more about the intangible aspects of your mind. Functionalists, on the other hand, studied the function of the mind. So these people studied the evolution and how that shaped the development of the mind. William James is one famous functionalist, and he thought the structuralists were wrong. So we couldn't really study the mind or human psychology through introspection. So they wanted to see what the purpose of the mind was. So why is it that we are thinking these things, and are our thoughts and the way that we engage in society as a whole a reflection of our ancestors when it comes to evolutionary psychology? Psychoanalysts believe that the human being is driven by conflicts and desires that might lie partially or entirely hidden below conscious awareness. So this had a lot to do with Sigmund Freud. Again, this has been debunked. We are not driven by conflicts, at least not entirely. Behaviorists studied that or argued that only observable behavior could and should be studied scientifically. But as we'll see shortly, that is not true. One example I've given so far is prejudice. If we could only study prejudice behaviorally, I think there would be a lot less researchers or fewer researchers in the area of prejudice and discrimination, because people are more likely to hide their prejudice generally now relative to maybe 60 years ago. Finally, we have the humanists, which emphasize individuals' dignity, worth, and free will. All right, so I've been lecturing for about half an hour, so I will stop here. This will be part 1, and I will record a part 2 shortly.